나는 가서 감성 고유 동아 타다를 죄제 타바토고 거래 세상에 내내 자다 네 토야게 삼데라 타바도니 삼바디 끼고 거래 세상에 타바도니 삼바디 봐라 하서 삼마간에 땅 거래 슬람나 나 삼바하들이야 담보 고유기 교인디게 삼당 거래제 나 고유 교인 삼나 땅들에 양만주기 고유기 죄들이야 안에 제게 지점 롱제경 안는 원반매 봐 안에 지금 도박하야 매봐 되네기네 니 지용 거래스 되네 그 원반매배 삼로 될래 되네 양만주기 디 될래 동하 안에 나서 지용 거래스 어두시네 뭐 수섬다다 되네 아직 되비게 죄 먼저 루이나다 되비게 체 간에이네야 네 이点말다 템보 따와 템보요 말해서 그디나 지셔던 귤초초제 제사데 이 안전 제 롱아마요라 다다메바 안에 제 다왕아마요라 다다메바 귤메바 차려야다 다 지소수기 안에 변조로시나 메바 차려야 안지기 소수고 쪽보 가보니고 예배다 메바 차려 제사다 데네기 다버팀부요 메바 차시 귤초초로지래서 두 삼단에데 코와들이야 안지게 가와께베네다 닝보가 민도와 셈베기 되네에서다 코와들레 마탄데 탑민도 셈베기다 코와들레 동아나서 받네나제 동아 이제 마르게 동아 안에 지기 중앙 추비 동아 빠도 메바도 대엔자다 코위에 동아 델레데 마탄데 탑민도 셈베 삼단에 귀엔토네 안데네 코와 등알로 주비 탈비 타르바세데 토고도 셈베 타르바도에 삼바디 두스진에 삼모디 야네야도 다 장고레스 지나디 타바등에 삼바 곰 냠내체 데네고 곰제 냠내야고 용알이야 용이 돈달이야 지라메이담이야 어느 소depu시주시네 진일라브라시에스 소depu시고레스 하나 가상도 데네시요레
Good morning. So yesterday we came to the part of the meditation where we've been building up by looking first at the importance of relying on a spiritual teacher. Thereafter, coming to recognize this remarkable opportunity that we've attained, but that it is impermanent, and therefore we need to make the most of this remarkable opportunity whilst we still have it. Then we came to look at the need to focus on accumulating the causes that lead to excellent rebirths and purifying those imprints on our mind that will lead to the lower realms. Thereafter, we came to look at that everything that draws us, that attracts us, tends to be pleasures that never can satiate us. Whether they are things that we see, or pleasant sounds, or tastes, and so forth, or even topics of thought. These never satisfy us. We always are left yearning for more. We never have experienced lasting pleasure through the attainment of any of these things that we strive for. This we needed to recognize. And not only recognize that, but the problems that come from striving to achieve these temporary pleasures, which are in their nature dissatisfactory. Recognizing the amount of time and energy that needs to go into achieving these pleasures, and the harm that is done to ourselves and others through striving to gain them. This was an important meditation we came to yesterday, to recognize just how we waste our time and energy pursuing things which can never satisfy us, that can never leave us feeling fulfilled afterwards. All these pleasurable experiences, if we list the lovely things we've done and enjoyed, they never resulted in lasting happiness. And in our endeavors to accumulate the causes to experience them through work and so forth, we all too often create non-virtue. So this understanding needs to come together with the prior meditations, because the prior meditation in particular, the recognition of the preciousness of this opportunity, but its great impermanence, serves as an impetus to make us look at this ever more with a sense of urgency. And when the recognition comes that how we spend our life really is just a waste of this opportunity, we need to have that strength of mind to strive to break long established habitual tendencies. This is important. So in this way, the meditations blend into each other. Moreover, finally, we come to the point of recognizing there is nowhere in cyclic existence that one can yearn for that happiness is stable and lasting. When we look at our world, we cannot point to a single person and say, yes, they live a life of lasting happiness, and each life after this will be another such life. It doesn't exist anywhere in cyclic existence. And finally, we turn for inspiration in our practice to our Lama and Yidam and the Buddhas, and request their inspiration that we may apply ourselves to this way of thinking diligently day and night, letting go of our strong habitual tendencies and embracing what is meaningful.
나 가상 시기도 된다 또 된가도 삼당할 때 코위 동화다 차 탈치네다 탈바 토부도 선배 탈바 돈이 삼바기에 디 공고를 지상 탈바 돈이 삼바 탈바도 토부도 선배게 탈바 돈이 삼바기에라 다디 기에 된다라 지상 코발이야 안지게 지나도 라다 미든로 가르게나 동화 강화돼 되는 쉐도와 선배게 강화돼 삼다에디 되게 지상 강화 삼당에 안 돈아 인보 가르르신다 델레 강아들에 탈비게 탈바서에 토부도 선배 삼르기에디 고미에디레다.
As we saw in the final line of the 5th verse, the outcome of this meditation is that we develop a fervent striving or fervent yearning for liberation's bliss. In other words, it's a liberation or freedom. We give rise or we generate a deep yearning to gain freedom, to gain freedom from the sufferings of samsara, to gain liberation from the sufferings of samsara.
다들이 쉬어야 된 니마 안도시네 지바레 다들마 쉬어야 돼 가서 남다 삼바 디 장바이 전나 시신 바유 침보이 덴베 자와 소소 타발라 주바님보 제버진이 로스.
Returning to the text, now the 6th verse, which builds on this meditation. This genuine wish induces intense mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness by which the root of the teachings, the Pratimoksha vows, are accomplished. Please inspire me to engage in this essential practice.
지나다 가상 안조 가르스네 코유 동아 타다를 죄자 탈바 토부도 선배 탈바 동이 삼바기 예월디 공고를 샤르와다 지나다 탈바 토부도 삼바에서 토부도 삼바에서 다 토위하게 탈람 가르치 오래스네 나 토위에 탈바 토위게 토부도 선배 동이 듬바기 요도 다 탈바 토위하게 람 냠는 체디 되는 시고래서 다디 디기 다 냠는 제사도 송고래.
Yeah, this is building on what we have come to in the previous meditation, which we have developed this fervent yearning for the bliss of liberation, to gain liberation from the sufferings of samsara. Here now we come to how to fulfill that wish. Because having the yearning, having this wish is essential. One must want to achieve a goal. But that alone is insufficient. One then needs to strive to achieve that goal, strive in the correct manner. And that is what is introduced here.
Sube nyamneche, sunre nyamne shiche, da denege chiche. Ande diga la karar yawarsan dirin da nemba kya de karsana samde nyamne shine juge de shine ju dingi ser shine komya de samde nyamne si ore. An diga la dame ba to be sherap da tongba ni to be dame ba to be sherap komya dingi de nemba kya ere. 지사다 코와 동화 탈을 주고 탈바 토구도 세배 탈바 토베에게 탈람 디디레다 진배 냠내지야 수름 냠내지야 쇠배 진배 냠내지야 수름 냠내지야 쇠배 냠내지야 준주시 되네 띵에지 신의 주 띵에지 냠내지야 되네 다음에 버도베 셔라콤 해야지 또 디죽디레 디 냠내지야 디 냠내지야 발레 되네 탈바 토고 탈바 토베에게 탈람 냠내지야 가상아도 시슈셔 봐 디가라 디린데 뭐 니야마도 말 아마 니로 삼다나 시랍 니로와.
What is the practice or training that we need to engage in? How is it that we are to train our mind? So firstly, we need to develop a motivation to achieve that particular goal. And that was cultivated in the previous verse, this intense yearning for the liberation, for liberation from the sufferings of samsara. So that is one's motivation. Then, to achieve that motivation, to fulfill that wish, one needs to train one's mind. And what does one need to train our mind in? And here, you'll hear the link from the trainings that one has been engaging in up to this point. Firstly, ethical restraint. Secondly, generosity. Thirdly, patience. Fourthly, joyous perseverance. Those same 4 practices that have been cultivated up to this point, now 2 additional practices are included. Namely, concentration, so single-pointed concentration or calm abiding, as well as, secondly, the wisdom realizing selflessness, or can be expressed as the wisdom realizing emptiness. So these 2 additional practices are added to the 4 that already the practitioner will have quite some experience of, namely, again, concentration and wisdom. So through cultivating now these 6, the prior 4 plus these 2, through cultivating these minds within us, we are cultivating the very method to achieve our goal, to fulfill our motivation, and gain liberation from the sufferings of samsara.
남다 선바디 장바이 시리 남다 선바세데 가상 쉬에데 지난 코유 동화 타달레 타르바세 토구두세 타르바 동예 선바디다 디레 남다 선바세 오래 디기데 군론치네 장바세 디군에 랑제 안에 가르쳐 그랬으나 템베자와 소소 타바라 세데 숨바디 디기 안주기 템베게 소소 타르베게 돈비게 다 돈비게 도쇼 안에 송예게 녀모바디파 안파 송고 그래스 템베 자와 소소 타바 소소 타베 송야게 독초데 가레 송고에데 요모바 송고에디 독초데 파 소소 덤베게 독초 송자디게 파 아니 야고 송고레스 디가네 송고레스 전시신 바유 된제 아니 예 송고레스 제상 군로데라 타바던예 셈비 군네랑 데네 파 송야데 가르스네 파랑 셈디 뜻가서 소소베 덤베 독초를 파 마땅한 도저히 요모바디게 기회를 바까 송고 그래서 이 송단에 근데 송세 잠바다 시신 바위에 된저 송고 그래서 송고
The first line, this genuine wish. So the genuine wish refers to the motivation that we've cultivated, this deep yearning to gain freedom from the sufferings of samsara. So the motivation is the genuine wish, induces intense mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness. So these are 3 minds by which now the third line, by which the root of the teachings, the Pratimoksha vows, are accomplished. So the Pratimoksha vows are in various classes. They are vows. So the Tibetan word vow is also the word for restraint. So you can translate it both ways. So these vows restrain the mind within the confines of what is ethical. In other words, they restrain one's mind from the afflictions. By accomplishing the Pratimoksha vows, one is turning away from the afflictions, embracing virtuous minds. And how does one do so? That's the previous line, by relying on the 3, mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness.
Zanda tembe zawa susu tarpike da susu tepe domba sede jizanda susu tepe domba san tembe zawa sanji yoko wang toya tarpa da tamje kimbe lam nyamne rimba chasan yago chunga la na susu tepeke domba di sungu gore jire da sungu jizanda de sungu za da juge susu tepe domba de la da juge kimbe chone ane dishe gore o kingi domba da ane da ane rabjung domba sa kingi domba da rabjung domba de ke chagore jizan di domba de ke pa ya ko sung gore di sunya de da juge lam tarba toya gi gyuda den mondio ko ba toya gyuda ane sanyo ko ba to gyu zawa de di cha de re di sung gore je da ze sunya de le ya so su ge domba shu je an domba shu an domba song je to sunya je yung gu wa ya domba ma shu be ne 디 도쇼다 소야 되가서 넘버 쉬에 되가서는 아주로 룽아이스 니주돈베나 주주래. 그 소주바 보마 마진벨렘바 보마 아니 미성아지바 봐봐 방와 안데 지금 언주인시바 미시 준시 방와디게로 자와디지로 자와시디로 제자다디 다디 가지고 돈바슈 아니 긴인 돈바슈야다 랍중 돈바슈시에 아니 송야 도쇼 송야 직차고래 다야 마슈베이나 아직 돈바디 마슈베야 디 도쇼 밀륜가 있으면 가상슈베나 륜가 있으면 예주 자와기네 지금에 선배 삼송야 직차고로 제자디 송야디 디송고래제 디 송야디 군로데라 콜위 동안 탈라를 줘서 탈바 토부도 선배 탈비군이라 다 탈바 토역이 된다라 가르쳐 버렸으네 륜의 이수 요건에 샬라 네비게 진예바디게 자와기네 지금에 예바디게 송고 그래서 제가 예바게 맞줘야지 이게 맞줘도 전시신 된제 전시신 된 바위 제바이나 아니 예바디 파송 되네 너무 송여도 륜의 이수 예주게 좀 수름 송고 그래서 야고 송고 그래서 디 송고 그래 제가 디인사 다 군로디 탈바도 예선비 군이라 다 송야디 릉아이스 예주팀이 출임 송야되지 대 송야기들라 탑람들이야 전시신 된제 전시신 된 바위 된제 송야 송고 그래서 디 송고한다 당한 가상한저 릉아이스 예주팀이 출임 송고라서는 출임 송야되 먼저 고반 규례 싸워서 가산 마슈사로와 진짜 송야디 디 송고래
The third line says, the roots of the teachings, the pratimoksha vows. So these are the vows of individual liberation, and the guarding of them is indispensable for one's spiritual development and for one's progression towards freedom. This is an indispensable training for every spiritual practitioner to engage in. So the pratimoksha vows have various divisions. There are, to summarize in brief, there are those of the ordained and those of the non-ordained. So both are included within the pratimoksha vows. They are the very root of the teachings, in that it is through willingly taking on these vows or accepting these vows and then keeping them, living within the restraints of these vows, that one is restrained, that one restrains oneself from engaging in unethical behavior. So, for example, if one does not make vows, one is like a vow not to do something, one is likely to do it. For example, to kill, to steal, to lie, to engage in sexual misconduct, and so forth. So therefore, by taking a vow, that serves as a strong restraint to restrain oneself from such unethical motivation, unethical behavior. The very motivation for keeping these vows is to gain freedom from the sufferings of samsara. Hence they are called the vows of individual liberation, liberation from the sufferings of samsara. This is the motivation why I am restraining myself from such physical, verbal, or mental behavior. And to keep these vows, one requires to train in or requires to utilize mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness. These three consciousnesses, these three minds that we looked at briefly yesterday, are indispensable for cultivating ethical restraint. And ethical restraint itself is the very basis of our trainings. So we've spoken about these three minds of mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness yesterday, and we've also spoken about ethical restraint, because ethical restraint is also the cause that leads to an excellent rebirth as a human or God. But it is also the foundation of, or the very root of the teachings, in that all further spiritual accomplishments also come about independent on excellent ethics.
어두시는 대내기에다 주름 소소대비 돈바 송야디 소소기 돈바 쉬제 안에 전시신 바위 된지하고 송고래서 송고야 직시 다 돈바 마시바이나 소소대비 돈비고 도초 예매되게 봐 안에식 전시신 된지 송고래서 군로디디 탈베동에 선비군이라 송고래제 다 대내 가르쳐 그래서는 예수의 제라 대내 주번잉보 제벌 진실 없어 주번잉보 지스다 denshi 랑토르기 냠네 제고레세 제세 주번잉보 제벌스 순가 제 주버제다 가르쳐 버렸는데 남공고로 제선 denshi 랑토르 덴바시 냠는 제고라 데네자다 람데 조 람데 냠는 제고라 와다 람데 제스다 녜준 삼바 쮸마마인 바 녜준 삼바 코와라 녜준 삼바 제주 타바 토구도 삼베 꾸냐라제 다디 야네야도 곰발레 데네 안징아도 람규레 기고래 제자다 람규레 기도 조디 가르선다 저기 델레야 람규레 기 곰야 조데다 람디 다 저기 제주님의 딩에서 공부 또 비어 공부도 남디배 누베침보 제주도 딩에서 신의 주야다 이 신의 주네 된듯이 다음에 봐도 동반이 다음에 봐도 셰랍곰 지상 다음에 봐도 셰랍디다 녀모비 녀보 문에디다 디시고 지상 다음에 봐도 셰랍곰 보고 그래 니 주바 제 신의 공야다 다음에 봐도 셰랍 공야데 닝보진의 조어진의 공부를 지상 닝보 세대 조엄 닝보 다디 배수신의 공부를 해서 지수를 조엄 닝보 지수는 주바 닝보 주바 제에 가려서는 신의 주 다음에 봐도 배셔라 공부디 조어진 공부를 그래서 이게 녀모 병원이 녀모 조어디로 와서 그래 다 수림도 대시에 살아와 수림자 대지 수림다 진바 수림 쇠버 준리디기 파 대시디시에 대시에서 다 디강을 가르고 왔습니다 람공고로 와서 람공묘도 조어디나데 신의 줍되네 신의 되네 다음에 봐도 배시로 조어진 공부를 해서 그래 진짜 녀모 배녀보디 빵고데 뒤로와
So looking at the second, third and fourth lines, it's through these three consciousnesses of mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness that we will be able to develop our ethics excellently, or to express it differently, we'll keep our vows well. And to have the determination to live within the restraints of the vows, one needs to have seen clearly what was presented in the previous verse, the faults of samsara, and thereby given rise to a strong yearning to gain freedom from the afflictions, because one has come to recognize that it's the afflictions that cause all our suffering. It's from the afflictions that all the sufferings of samsara arise. So we restrain ourselves from the influence of the afflictions by living well within the restraints of the vows. So in this way, the root of the teachings is living within the restraints of the vows, because they keep us from being overwhelmed and influenced by the afflictions. This then serves to subdue our mind, calm our mind, because our mind is not swayed continuously by desiring this or being repulsed or averse towards that. Our mind is subdued or tamed. This then means that these two additional trainings of single-pointed concentration and then the wisdom realizing selflessness can be attained with relative ease. Because the mind is subdued from being overwhelmed so by the afflictions, one can develop this powerful concentrated mind of calm abiding or single-pointed concentration. And this is indispensable, this powerful mind, for one's wisdom realizing selflessness to have the actual strength required to eradicate the afflictions. So ethics serves to confine our mind from the afflictions, thereby it's subdued, enabling the relatively easy generation of single-pointed concentration. That powerful mind of single-pointed concentration is able then, when conjoined with the wisdom realizing selflessness, to be the actual direct antidote to the afflictions, to eradicate the afflictions. This then brings us to the fourth line. In the fourth line, please inspire me to engage in this essential practice. So the essential practice here refers to what is in addition, because ethics has been presented earlier, as has mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness. So the essential practice refers to these two additional trainings which are essential to gain liberation. So the essential practice then is single-pointed concentration and the wisdom realizing selflessness, which is the actual direct antidote to the afflictions.
제산도 주바 세대 냠 주바 세대 냠len 제 시고로와 제산 주바 세대 때 냠len 제디 나나 카르디 용을 선다 수림다 진바다 쇠바 존재 3대 셰럽 차상회대 버와 지산 주요 다 don다라 don데 직디 가르순 거라서네 담보 군롱 코르에 타달라 줘야지 대 탈바 토구도 선배 탈비 군의 랑 데네 소소 탈비기 don비 도저 자와 소소비 추림비 송야디 자와레스 제산 디 자와 시송제 안에 디당이야 진바당 안 존재당 산 존재시 냠내제 쇠바 냠내제 되네 안에 지게 띵해진 신의 줍 되네 다음에 보도 비셔라 공고레스 대수 차산 냠내제별 전시신 바위된제 안에 추림수야 진배 냠내제 쇠바 공면 존재점이야 안에 되네 타고도 띵해진 신의 줍이야라 전시신 바위된제 띵해진 지신의 줍 되네 다음에 보도 비셔라 공전에 도시네 나도 도시는 공지 다음에 봐도 비셔라 공발에 되네 녀모바 타다다 제비 탈바도 두스토보고래 해서 또나 님보들다 탈바 토야 그 군론들라 코리 동안 탈바 토고도 선배 군일롱 군론 티제 군론 딜로이 토네 내가 제야 돼 그래서는 자와 추짐송 되네 진바 쇠바 전제체 아니 제게 되네 삼대 제신이 신의 줍 신의 공 되네 신의 다음에 봐도 비셔라 고 라동 줍 누시는 실라인도 조금전에 되네 코르웨 동안에 조고 탈바 토고 그래서 제산 될이야 다디냠네 제발라 전시신 바위된 거 어디 계시 모르겠어 전시신 바위된 냠네지 두신 토고 그래서 도나님 부지 숨어라
Just to repeat then what I've just presented to make sure it's clear. So the final word in the third line for us, accomplished. So accomplished means to practice. And if it's past tense, and one has practiced successfully. So accomplishing means practicing. And what is it that one is practicing? Well, these are the 6 trainings. The 4 that were previously mentioned of ethics, generosity, patience, joy, perseverance, and the additional 2 of concentration and wisdom. So all 6 are to be accomplished, because it's through accomplishing all 6 that one fulfills one's heart wish of gaining freedom from the sufferings of samsara, attaining the lasting, stable happiness of liberation. So accomplished refers to all 6. And again, because it's through practicing and accomplishing all 6 that one fulfills one's motivation and gains freedom from the sufferings of samsara. But to achieve that goal, one has to develop the very root of the teachings with a particular focus on accomplishing the root of the teachings. That is ethical restraint. So the beginning of the line, the root of the teachings, that specifically refers to ethical restraint. And for ethical restraint to be accomplished, mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness are indispensable. These are indispensable for all the trainings, but one has to accomplish the root so that the others can flourish well. So right from the beginning of one's training, one relies on these 3, mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness, to develop ethical restraint. And it's through developing ethical restraint, through relying on mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness, one develops one's ethical restraint. And whilst one is developing one's ethical restraint, one's mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness are becoming greatly accomplished. And these minds are also required, particular mindfulness and vigilance, for the subsequent trainings, those of generosity and so forth, the other 5. So one develops one's mindfulness and vigilance first in relation to ethics, but continues to rely on them with other trainings. So when you see here on the third line, the root of the teachings, the pradimoksha vows, are accomplished. So the root of the teachings, the pradimoksha vows, refers to ethical restraint. Implied are the other 3 of generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance. And then we come to are accomplished, but these other 3 are not the root of the teachings. That is specifically ethics, but implied one also is practicing generosity, joyous perseverance, and patience. And are accomplished refers to, so are being practiced, all 6 of them. Then when you come to the 4th line, essential practice, this refers to the additional 2. Because the first 4 trainings of ethics, generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance are required to attain excellent rebirths, and excellent rebirths are required in order to continue our progression towards eventually attaining liberation from cyclic existence. But the 2 trainings that have to be added on, the 2 essential practices that need to be added to those 4 are concentration and wisdom. These 2 are what are meant by the essential practice, these 2 additional trainings. And for both concentration and wisdom, like the other trainings, to be accomplished, to be practiced properly, one relies on mindfulness, vigilance, and conscientiousness. In other words, these 3 are utilized throughout one's training.
Dene ane chigi chado da, sena da, dene ki nyomo barikti, mangbo chigi disu chasang an zuki kangan chayadi chasang di yungurwa. Chisadang an zuki shengi chikchala kuma kuya, ane shengi chigi loyam chaya, ane dene ki rik mangbo chigi duashala dene ki yungur. Duashala na yuyde chakwa chayadu, dehi chakwa wangi kuma kuya re, loyam chaya re, adu shine mangbo shungur. Dene kondro kejin, da duashala wangi semchen soche ba yungur re. Then yang kondro wangi kondro di genjin de ne semjen shen so jue ba de shen le chu su xie ba an ge jing na gu du shen le yo re je za dang de ka san nga kya xia dang gu ma xia dang lo yim xia de di cha sa ne je de due xia le de ne ge yong go re an de ji semjen so jue ba la so ba de zui an ji kondro le de ne ge yong go re je za de ne za dang de zo de ne ge yong mo ba sung go ye de na ne zo da ka se 뒤에는 용서도 숨들네 되샤 셰다 디모 숨샤시 뒤용거래 다 되샤 셰다디 용서도 가와서도 용거래서는 자와 마릭바 세데 당한 지금 마싱베 마시베 마릭바 세데 덴진 마릭 다신 마릭바 세 데네데 용거래 세다 아주 강한테 이게 셈 녀모바게 가르가르 요서세 데네릭 망보 용거래 대수 차사 다 송고야디 수림이 독처러와 대소 간의 연구는 되샤 셰다되는 연구래. 되샤 셰다디게 가르고 자와 가르티고 다 자와 투서디 마릭바세 투고래 예제다. 제자데 마릭바세 되는 거 송고래. 제자 그 면주를 마소네 나제디 가와 연구도 자와 가와 연구 되지. 자와들 면제제바네 자와디 메바 쇠제바네 네 나즈샤사 메바 차루고로. 디나징 아주 용모계 그 송고에 그 용모계 그 용모디 파 가와 연구도 자와 파 자와 가와도 연구에는 마릭바드는 연구를 제자다 마릭바드를 녀보티 이제 고 메바 쇠셔바네 딘 자와 코노 메바한자 녀모비게 해요 말이네 아주 그 디파사야기네 연구 말에 지래
Summarize the 6th verse together with the 5th verse that we looked at yesterday. One needs to reflect, as was mentioned yesterday, reflect deeply and from many perspectives on the grave consequences of striving for the pleasures of samsara, recognizing both the futility of doing so in that one is never satisfied, one is never content, but also not only recognizing the futility of doing so. So this futility should lead to this recognition of futility leads to a sense of fatigue, of exhaustion, of I'm wasting my lives like this. So that's the first part. The second part is to recognize the harm that actually follows. It's not just wasting one's time. There are grave consequences. And the grave consequences we come to recognize through understanding what is the root cause of all the sufferings of samsara. Why is it that I keep striving for the pleasures of samsara, even when I've come to recognize that some of them are harmful for me, but I keep engaging in them or enjoying them despite knowing that they will harm me. So the second part is to recognize the causes, which are the afflictions. And where we need to come to through this meditation is to recognize that the futility and develop a sense of fatigue for striving for the pleasures of samsara. And then secondly, to develop a deep aversion to the afflictions. So where we come to is not so much an aversion to the pleasures of samsara, but the aversion to the affliction that makes us want them. Because then we are watching our mind rather than looking at pleasures of samsara. We are watching our mind, guarding our mind from these afflictions, recognizing that, for example, attachment, that this mind of attachment that draws us towards things, again, whether they are things of the material world or views and thoughts and ideas, this attachment that draws us to it serves to strengthen our mightiness, leads us to lie to others, leads us to engage in speech over things of no importance, leads us to push others aside so as to fulfill our desires, leads us to putting ourselves first, and thereby creating a karma that will lead to suffering. So too with anger. Through anger, we harm others and we harm ourselves. We speak in a harsh way towards others. We speak in a harsh way about others, and we may even physically harm others. And then ignorance, which is a mind that, so there are many forms of ignorance, but the two major ones is the ignorance of actually just not understanding what is harmful and what is beneficial, as well as then the other great form of ignorance, the ignorance of not understanding reality, that leads us to think that something that can never lead to happiness actually will, and therefore I want it. Or the ignorance that leads us to think, if I push this away, have it out of my life will be better. But this too is not in accordance with reality. So here, in this presentation, I've mentioned 3 primary afflictions. The affliction of attachment, anger, and ignorance. These 3 are called the 3 poisons, because they poison us. They poison every consciousness that follows from them, in that those consciousnesses are contaminated. They are not, even virtuous ones are not pure. When we then talk about ethical restraint, it really is restraining us, where we restrain ourselves from the afflictions. In particular, these 3, and when we get skilled, in particular against our ignorance. So this is why ethical restraint is called the root of the teachings, because restraining ourselves ethically guards us against the afflictions. And it's the afflictions that keep us bound in samsara. The eradication of the afflictions, the cutting them at their root, leads to our liberation from the sufferings of samsara. So this is why ethics is the very root of the teachings. And if we conjoin our training in ethics with, because there have been 6 trainings mentioned, with the next 4, generosity, patience, joyous perseverance, and concentration, with ethics and those 4 making 5, we are developing the required inner skills to develop the final practice, the 6th, the wisdom realizing selflessness. The wisdom realizing selflessness requires the strength of mind of concentration, which it itself requires the subdued mind of ethics and the merit and skill that comes through joyous perseverance, patience, and generosity. Then one's wisdom can be developed, and wisdom is indispensable because it is the direct antidote to the afflictions. Ethics is the root that needs to be developed so that we can develop the essential practice of concentration and wisdom, and thereby sever the root of the afflictions, namely ignorance. And finally, the way that one should hear this is through recognizing from the prior verse, the 5th verse, that we are like a patient, someone who's ill, and the cause of our illness has been identified as the afflictions in general, with the root cause being ignorance. So we recognize ourselves as a patient. We've been diagnosed by the doctor, the Buddha, and now we have been presented with the medicine to take. So the course of medical treatment is cultivating these 6 practices, and the primary one, or the essential one, will be concentration and wisdom. But that requires the supplementary trainings to have sufficient strength to free us from this disease. So of these three poisons, aversion or anger is quite easy to see that it's harmful. But we need to recognize in all instances it's harmful. Attachment, much more difficult to recognize, especially in all instances that it's harmful, but this needs to be recognized. What's most difficult to recognize is how both attachment and anger follow from ignorance. So to talk a little bit about this, because this is how we come to identify that whilst we need to abandon attachment and aversion, we really need to get rid of the cause for attachment and aversion, because attachment and aversion follow from the ignorance of self-grasping. So this needs to be understood so that we have the motivation, the determination to eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping. So attachment, as well as anger, follow from ignorance. And how so? So listen to these expressions. So I or me or mine. I like this. I want this. So from that expression, we can see, or we can hear how from I, in relation to something, I like this. I agree with this. I want this. Similarly, this hurts me. This is hurting or harming my loved ones. I do not want it. This is aversion, pushing something away. So the attachment, I want. The anger, I do not want. Both come from the sense of I. So too do the other afflictions. Pride and jealousy, these all come from this ignorance of self-grasping. And how we can also come to recognize this is in our various expressions of attachment or anger. I want to have a lovely holiday. I want to have a nice weekend away. I want to wear nice clothes. I want to look good. At the heart of all these thoughts is I. And so in this way we can come to recognize that it's from ignorance that both attachment and anger follow. In fact, all our afflictions follow from ignorance.
지난 삼 코로나 다때 nga 세데 nga 줄이야 가네스 두 세비 소수게 섬리야 세 가네스 난구도 nga데 가네스 샤르구도 섬리야 샤르타 낭타로 가네스 난구도 디디 디네시 때 소수게 nga 세데 nga 세 저로 왔다 nga 세데 제사다 소수 삼로 나라 가네스 리거지네 두 섬다네 nga sedi sosugi phungbo dang chik gaya la ma deba korong loso chik phungbo gala ma deba chi korong wene drup deba yeba di yeba ru chi nga tu lo ya nangor wa na nangor wa di din deneshi nangore deni nang yo de na wa na shin chi dagarang yore sambigi samno chi yore di dela kanza marik dasen marik ba se di reda benenga ju dasen marik ba se du singa ju nga se samta de nga ju samda de nga se di 소소라 nga se samdo de sosu yu phungbo dang chaje gangla ya ma de ba ji korong wene yue de ba ju ji nga ju le nang go ro da ji nga di na su di da du ba na se ko le deni ge na wa na shin da ga ra yore sem bi sem ding le yang ju deni ge sam jin ba chi yore di jin ba de la da da se mari pa se di la ko le
So we need to, the first step in this meditation is to come to recognize for ourselves how our I, or our sense of self, appears to our mind. So this takes some investigation, but it appears to have a couple of characteristics, you could say. Firstly, our sense of self appears as if it is independent of, separate from, or independent from our aggregates. Or to express it differently, our I appears to be independent of our mind and our body. It seems to be something different from our mind and body. And then it seems to have a sense of reality to it. It seems to be real. It's something that really exists. So this is how the I appears to us. Then we grasp at it as existing in the way that appears. In other words, we grasp at, or we believe that how it appears to our mind is how it exists. We believe that our I, our sense of self, the way it appears to us is in accordance with reality. This is how it exists. So we grasp at that, believing this is in accordance with reality. So this is the self-grasping, grasping at the self as existing in the way that we believe it too.
제가 nga se di ondu sine dadi ha goyalia gale khashor cha de re 제가 dinigi thone da chige daruk mangboli gore 제가 dinigi ane 제가 donda dang du samda ba nga se di nga samna lo khorna ji nga se di du sine nga yo ba che da samno di nga samna la nga se susora nga samno ta de nga di lo le ya kanis nang du si be na ma di ta de nga se di da phungbo da cheche gangla ming da ba la ma de ba korong wen ye de ba shi na du go res di na wa na shi yore sem bi sem ding nga de ne samlo chi res yore sem bi jin ba chi res di da se ma ri ba res chesan di ngan ju go ngo chwe go ha go go re chesan di ha go ne ha go di ga se di de la de ne da ngan ju nyom mo ba de ja khong ren ya cha sang nyom ma cha de le de ki go re chesan da de ni gi za di ngan ju gi ngo chwe go nga za ha go go de di re se go da dang bo di xin go ye di phungbo la ma de wa ming da ba la ma de phungbo da an che xie ming da ba la ma de ba korong wen ye ba nang go re je ma de ba chi ma de ba la de da rang wa yo ba ro de se ma de ba yo ba se rang wa yo ba che go rang yo ba che go ba de ni nang go re di yue na wa na xin da jin ba de la da se ma ri ba da un yo mo ba tham che ze yu ti de 제산 디 낭타디 당보 하고 거야 되게 지머리에 저거다.
So this first step of the meditation is difficult, and it really takes quite some investigation to get to actually see how our I appears to us, because it's ever present. We're very used to it. We aren't so therefore it's difficult to come to see something that we're so habituated to. But the way, when we come to recognize our sense of self, it will seem as if it is independent of our body and mind, as if it is independent of it. And it doesn't, and being independent, it is not dependent on anything. including it doesn't require labeling. Why? Because it seems to just exist. That sense of I just seems to exist. And this is then usually expressed as, and I'll use several synonyms, it exists by way of its own nature, it exists by way of its own essence, it exists by way of its own characteristics. So the sense of self, it just seems to exist. It doesn't seem as if it requires anything, such as the body and the mind, or even labeling. It just seems to exist. But it's not merely that there's an appearance of the self, then our mind grasps at it, as if it exists in the way that it appears. This is true. Our self just does seem to exist. So, of course, we grasp at it as existing in this way, because that's how we believe it does. And it's from this mind that grasps at the self as existing independently of anything, it is from this that all our afflictions arise.
Denige du shin dangbo denishin nga se de so so lo la nang tha de nang du a sen be ge da di ha go che da ha go de da sam ne de da ko sim che go sim ju che go da che ba che go de shi ka ha du kan du se du sam ne na wa na xin ji lo la na wa na xin ji yue dang wi ni su le du e min du sam be ge da nga ju che ba che go de.
That's the first step in the meditation. And again, it's a difficult step to come to recognize how our I appears to us. Then the second step is to, well, if that's how it exists, let me prove it. If something is in accordance with reality, it should be provable. So let me now investigate. This is the second step. Let me investigate to see whether it exists in the way that it appears to my mind or not. I believe this is how it is. So let me do my investigation and see whether my belief is in accordance with reality or not. So this is the second step, the step of investigation.
다 수보들이야 안줄에 풍보가 세 여와 채워져 수기 풍보 초유 풍보 두시보 두시 넘버시 풍보 세 지시에도 남보다 안줄 수기 풍보에 때도 다 수기 풍보 때서 내가 세대 다 수기 풍보 tel에 된신비 맞대봐 나식 두개 민도세 대신 나야 돼 가서 수기 풍보라 맞대봐 그런 원에 주대 능고로 나와 나신다 수기 풍보라 맞대봐 두개 민도 삼에 제바 제도 수기 풍보라 되고 두개 민도 제바 제도 다가제 저기 락바당 강바 락바 지주 차산에 nga 레베스네 nga 레요 말아 지선에 nga 말해 다 되니게 수부를 차시 리리리 마 직수부 공부하는 되는 수부에 나라 샤차 빡바 안에如果 차산 리리리는 삼단은 nga 되래요 말해 nga 되래요 말해 이나다 nga 말할 때 nga 풍보들 맞대 봐지 그런 원이 두에서 되네 예나 풍보 맞대봐 예바네 풍보디 가와 줘베네 나다 혼이 대화스 가요 말아 제자디 대화 매바치 내고 인자다 아는 가서 풍보디 파줘 나디데 샤치 줘야 두에 민도선데 디요 말바다 제상아 나 주고에 풍보디 파서 고마 겹치 파줘버나 나 주고도 거래 제자다 풍보디 나 주게 예제간 두스 되되베네 마줘져 두스 되되베네 구경마 되되베네 nga dede nga jugme la gore chesa nga dede chesa da nga subo delia nase ta de nga nagi du la gore nga kibu me nga nagi du so chesa dine do chesa de 풍보 da ma de bege nga ji yo ma da ka se 풍보 la nga zhou de 풍보 de lo so yewa che me de nga se de nga ji 풍보 de ngo ji ba ma do ngo lo so yewa che me de ji ma do 풍보들의 오 로스 맞대 봐지 나치 이겨 말도 시 잠다돼 시대 마주바 나서 강라 라메다데 라메
So for one to really be able to do the second step well, the first step needs to be done fully. In other words, one needs to know what one is searching for. Because the second step is investigating to see whether the self exists in the way that I believe it to. So the first step is to recognize how we believe the self to exist. If that's done well, if one's been successful in identifying that, and it is difficult, then one at least knows what one is looking for. But nevertheless, in the process of training, one keeps trying. So the self appears to us as if it is independent of the body and mind, of the aggregates. It doesn't require them, and it doesn't require even labeling by mind. So now we go into the process of investigation. So there are 5 aggregates. One is physical form, and the others are mental, feeling, differentiation, compositional factors, and consciousness. So to take the physical aggregate form. So this is our body then. So if our eye appears as if it is independent of our body, not requiring them, unrelated to them, our sense of self seems to be other than our body. So the investigation will start with looking to see if we can find our self within our body somewhere. Because, we look for ourself within our body somewhere, and this very quickly we can recognize it's not. And we do so by mentally dividing our body up into various parts, putting a hand over there, putting a leg over there, putting an organ over there, and none of them would we say, that body part is me. By removing this body part and putting it over there, now my sense of self is there rather than here. None of that would say. You'd rather say, well, that's my arm, but it's not me. So we recognize then quite easily that our body is not, our eye is not to be found within any of the body parts. But then this leaves us with a dilemma, because if my self is independent of my body, I will say to you, I am sitting here. And what is the basis for me saying I'm sitting here? Because my body is here. I cannot say I'm sitting over there when my body is here. This would make no sense. I cannot say I am in Bendigo when my body is here. That would make no sense. And when we think about, our activity, I walked here, later I'll walk over there, this is all dependent on what our body is doing. And furthermore, if our body is, the elements of our body are not in harmony, then there's illness. And then we say, I'm ill. And we're saying, I am ill, independence on this body not feeling so good. So this then doesn't seem to be concordant. This body, this sense of self that seems independent of the body, clearly though, it is not. Because whilst I cannot find it in the body anywhere, also, I am here, not there, because my body is here. I am healthy or I'm ill in relation to the state of my body. So how can this I then be independent of the body? But this is how it appears to our mind.
Adu samdai de nga se de jidang ngansu subu phungbo nga dang ngai phungbo de yi kha re de ine nga se de rang ge su gi phungbo le tue ba ji tue wan tue ne ye ba ju bo re jesa da tue ne ye ba ga se ne ma tue ba ne phungbo ga wa zho we ne nga da ding yi ji nga de phungbo lo su zho ren xie ju er de yo ma jesa phungbo se le nga se de phungbo le tue go re su gi phungbo le tue go re jesa da nga zhu gu ye se de su gi phungbo pa yo gu che ba le tue go re nga de ye se de su gi phungbo ma yo ji de ba le tue go re jesa de nga de se de su gi phungbo ma yo de ba ni de le lo su ye wa ngo lo tong ya ji me de jesa da nga se de su gi phungbo le tue de ba ji ma do su gi phungbo le ma de ba ji yong gu me me de sim ju chi de su gi phungbo le ma de ba nga ji nye yo ma de jesa me ba za da nga de ji sam na ga so ne nga se de su gi phungbo le ma de ba ko rong wen ne ju de ye ba ji nang go re jesa di nang su de no zhe cha de re se jesa ga re song du sim ju chi de nga su gi nga se de su gi phungbo le de ba ji ha go yong de a de ma de ba ko rong wen ne ju de ba ji min do a sen be da di sam no de no zhe re da wa sen be ji de du xian ha go du go ba da.
In the first step, we come to recognize that the self seems to be something other than the body and the mind. separate from it, different from it, not dependent on it. But now we come to the second step and we investigate and we see this cannot be the case. This cannot be the case. There has to be a relationship between the self and the body. And they gave the examples of whether one is feeling healthy or ill, whether one is here or there. Clearly, there is a relationship between the self and the body. So the consequence of this is the way we believe the self to exist. It clearly doesn't. We've now, intellectually or analytically, we've come to recognize this, that the self appears to us in a particular way. But when we look, when we investigate, we see actually it cannot exist in the way that it appears. Therefore, this appearance is not in accordance with reality. It just is wrong.
Oh, yeah. Although Senang that Pumbo Shimjuche, and do say Shimjuche, that do Chebache, the Kazam Chilia, Nga said the Pumbo down, and it saw the Namshe Pumkala, Matio Rangon to the Mindu Sempegeta, Tenigi Kala, Matio Rangon, it's out in the Mindu Sempega, some Chili Gorta. Tenigi that do Shimjuche the Kala, Matio Rangon to Meba Tonsan, the Tonyo, did over de la Tonyo to Beshera Lagore. Chesanga said the Kansa said the Pumbona Cheshe Kala Madova Rangon to be Tomba, Meba de la Tomba de la Tony Lagor, Dame Palagore. Indeed, that Nga said Kala Madova Rangon to the Zawajini Mindua Sampegi, Hakokan de la Tonyo to Beshera, Dame to Beshera Lagore. The D Hanzuki Yane Yado Comche Nuba Chertana, the Shi Hanzukula, Nga said, Kala Barangon Yore, Sembe Samlodi, Meva Chadogore. Chesa di Meva Chadu, Dusha Kondokia, Yomokia Chesa Meva Chagore, Ese, that the dining body, Dordine, Jusha Denisi.
Having done the investigation, that second step, we then come to the conclusion, which is the way the self appears to us is not how it exists. And how that then is expressed. The way the self appears to me is not how it exists. It is therefore empty of existing in the way that it appears. The self appears to exist by way of its own essence or nature, but it's empty of existing by way of its own essence or nature. It's empty of inherent existence. So this then is the conclusion of the meditation, realizing that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. And this understanding, realization is a bit of a big word, but this understanding is in accordance with reality. And it's the wisdom understanding emptiness. And this is the direct antidote to the ignorance of self-grasping. The ignorance of self-grasping, we've come to recognize that self-grasping is an ignorance because it believes the self to exist in a way that it just does not. Therefore, it's an ignorance. And we've now developed the mind of wisdom that understands reality. And that is directly opposite to the ignorance that misperceives reality. Therefore, this wisdom is the direct antidote to the ignorance that is the root cause of all our afflictions. So that then is this meditation very briefly summarized.
Mora Kava said the Koron Shantachilla Matuba Koron when you took to Bishobaina, the Jimora Kava the Chen Rojida, Kava the Subject, Chinapora says Napotan Shabane, Mora Kava the Yorbes in Diomare, Mora Kava Yomacasan, that in Mora Napore. Chesa the Jinia Mora Kava the Shen Chen Matuba Koron Yobaina, Chen Napotan Shabana, Mora Kava the Yokore. Diomare. Chesada Morakawa said the Anjigi Moragi Kado Train Gavatan Shaban, tell a dinner, Morakawa said Ligor Mato Deep when the train Matioba, Motakabo Yamare. Cesada de Jim Motakabo di Twenty Jevakepchi, Nakotashan Gel, Angemoda Nabore. Cesada Garisinico, Twin Nakotasha, the Mota Nabore. Cesar Susico Motakabo, the Nabosedi, called Twendo Kartan and tell a twin, Tagormato, tell a Matioba. Rang when you do to get cowboy, the rang when you do again, and then now what you have been doing. It is just Bengas Chique, Savuraji, Tonto Yashin, Dua.
Everything that we think of, so everything that appears to our mind, we misperceive how it exists. It appears as if it exists by way of its own nature. But when we investigate, as we just have done now, we recognize this cannot be the case. So, for example, if you drove here and you have a car outside, your car is a particular color, and you will say that my car is that color. But more than that, when you investigate in the same way as we investigated for the self, how your car appears to your mind. So let's say it's white. So how does your white car appear to your mind? It appears as if it is the color, as if it is white, and it is so without being dependent on anything else. It appears as if it is separate from anything else. But when you investigate, you very quickly can understand this is not the case. Because at one point, when it was in the factory in another country, it certainly was not white. It was the color of metal. Then, independent on it being sprayed white, it was white. If the factory had sprayed it a different color, it would have been that color. So it was dependent on the color being sprayed upon it and then being labeled by mind that it could be called white. So it is dependent on a variety of causes and labeling to be validly called white. But it is not something that is self-existent, which is, though, how it appears to our mind. So this is the case with all phenomena, the self, the color of one's car, and so forth.
탐지기 강화용에 유조 자와디 텔레든 용거래 해지 다세 말이 바래지 다디 심주지에제 만도 풍문가 해야지 풍보라 마대와 랑응원의 주버디 자와기니 민도와 샘비게 또비게 또는도 하고는 로데라 나 다음에 봐도 별로 하시고래 제산디 다음에 봐도 별로디 디공고래 했을 때 다음에 봐도 또 유튜브 셰럽세디 디시고래 제산데 주번이 뭐지바 디가 저기 녀모바 탐지기 년보디 디레스 디공발레 때는 아주 딱 녀모바디 아주 랑고네 강래 랑고네 주바스 요래 셈베 짐바디 방고고래 디방송 바이나 된 탈바스 도고래 해지래.
We summarized in what we've looked at, that the way our self and everything else that appears to our mind, everything we think of, appears, is as if it is independent of everything else. It doesn't appear to our mind as being dependent on a wide number of causes and parts and labeling. It appears as if it's independent of anything. But our self, like all other phenomena, do not exist in this way. So therefore, the way our self appears to our mind is not how it exists in reality. But we believe that it exists in the way that it appears to our mind. And this belief, because it's not in accordance with reality, is an ignorance. And it grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears. And when we do the investigation repeatedly over a sustained period, we come to recognize the self, like all phenomena, are empty of existing the way they appear. They do not exist by the way of their own nature or essence. Rather, they are dependent. They may appear to us as being independent, existing without needing to rely on causes and parts and labeling, but this is just not the case. They are dependent. So the wisdom, the mind that understands this, is a mind that is in accordance with reality, hence it's a wisdom. And it's understanding selflessness or emptiness, and therefore we have come to the wisdom realizing emptiness. And this is the direct antidote to the ignorance of self-grasping. This is the direct antidote to the root cause of our samsaric existence. And when it's developed to the point of sufficient strength, and we come to realize emptiness or selflessness directly, then we finally come to sever the root cause of samsara, and we gain freedom from the afflictions and samsara itself. This is how liberation is attained. We can conclude there for this morning, but if you have questions, then please feel free to ask. Venerable Stephen?
I'm a bit worried there's going to be people, because the mind wasn't examined, I'm a bit worried people are going to think, okay, well, I'm not even on the body, maybe I am my mind.
Kena tutsuyama keni nato suk mare selpo song yini nato yi mare asa sem mare di sung rotan.
Nada dinero that azu sem snipin choaro shebalaya choal bhashavena tanga ju nga se di choal madio bige chowadinen dewa meba jiyo를 besene choal dewa meba jiyo mares that jezada then chowa korong ngade chowa de rebesene dia mares then mayimbi kim전 des bene nga ju nga se di choal야 dedu dewa da dungwa bene karsore yewa cheyu nga juge choal야 dunga shiye di bene 다 초와 대화디 nga래 레벨람나 딩아 마레스 가르선 초와 둥아기 비kapla nga 요레데 이네 초와 대화디 요 말아와스 디나신도 초와 둥아디 nga래베세 디야 마레스 제가선 초와 대위 개와기 비kapla nga 요레디네 초와 둥아디 요 말아와스 지선 초와 고로 nga래베세는 nga 마레스 삼다 디시 담보디 돌드시셔다.
The process of investigation, investigating whether the I is a mind or not, is exactly the same as with the body. So let's take, you can and should look at a variety of consciousnesses. So let's take feelings. So feelings are of three types. There's the feeling of happiness or pleasure, there's the feeling of suffering or displeasure, and there's neutral feeling. So if we ask ourselves, right now I'm feeling quite good. So if of those three, I'd say, I'm happy. So I'm feeling happy right now. And we say this, I am happy. And it seems like the sense of self, though, is still separate from happiness, or the feeling of happiness. And when we investigate, we come to look at this feeling of happiness, so investigating the mind, to see whether the self abides there, and it clearly doesn't. So the self is not the feeling of happiness, because the sense of self is always present. But we are not always happy. Sometimes the feeling that arises is suffering, or it's a neutral feeling. So we cannot be that particular consciousness. That's not possible, because consciousnesses come and they go. But the self, though, appears independent, unrelated to anything else, separate. But I've just said, I'm happy. So how can my sense of self be unrelated to this feeling of happiness? Not possible. So we see again the same dichotomy as earlier on, and we see we cannot be a self-existent self, an independent self. It's not possible, independent from the mind.
지상 소와 대화된가 있나 둥어용 외갑로 소와 대화도 요 말이 이나 nga 요르와스 지상 소와 대화된가 있나 nga 요 말라고 그러와 소와 둥어기 외갑로 소와 둥어 대화 매 봐서 nga 요 말라고 그러와 지상 nga 요에르와스 지상다 소와 둥어된가 있나 그래서 소와 대화된가 있나 소와 둥어기 외갑로 소와 대화도 요 말이 지상다 nga 요 말라고 그래 이나 nga 요르와스 지상도 소와 된가 말에 소와 둥어대 양가 말에 소와 대화대 nga 말에 소화당 nga인디 카가레스 다디두시네 삼당보 삼당다디레.
So when you do this investigation, again, just feeling is taken as the illustration. We come to recognize I am not any feeling, whether it's a feeling of happiness or a feeling of suffering. I cannot be either of those. I cannot find a sense of self within there. And moreover, these feelings come and go. So then, but clearly, so whilst I'm not that feeling, that consciousness of feeling, it doesn't mean that the self doesn't exist, because I know the self exists. But what it does mean is the self is not that particular consciousness.
Oh yeah. That dinige nga mare nga de chowa de mare de ta nga de chowa le tingyu mare sene nga zo samlo na la karsone nga de chowa le ma den ba koron won ju ba nan go res. Da din na wa na chi yue de me de cheba ina da nga de chowa le ma den ba du ge mi du cheba chena da yo ma res. Karsone nga se de nga de bu du se di 초와 디기 초와 대화디 깨와라 라리 거. 그래서 초와 대화디 깨는데 나 대부도 올라고. 그래서 초와 대화를 띵 거래. 그래서 초와 동화를 깨는데 갑라 나 기분도 나 강하더라. 초와 동화를 띵 거래. 그래서 다 초와 디도 강라에 맞으면 초와라 맞든 비기 나 대화사다 나 기부셔야 돼. 나디 로소지 초와 디도를 맞든 비기 대화 매바 초와 디도를 맞든 비기 나셔야 돼. 용하여 말이야. 매바레스. 그래서 누우시는 삼다이도 두 심주치에도 초월에 되도록 맞den바 나 되보다 나 기보셔야 돼. 나셔야 돼. 초월에 맞den비 나 로소지 이거 말이야. 디매바 인자 디매바 하고 와들 다매바도 비셔. 셔랍시 그래. 제자다 되니게 하고 해도 대신 가서 삼는 나라야 나셔야 초월에 맞되면 그런 원이 줍도 여바지 로디 다 로시에 노트인 바다 하고도 그래.
What one comes to as the conclusion of the investigation. So the first part of the meditation was how does the self appear? The second is to investigate, to see if the self is independent, unrelated to the body and mind. And here we looked for the self with in relation to the particular consciousness of feeling. And we come to recognize that a feeling cannot be the mind. Cannot be the self, sorry. A feeling cannot be the self. But we cannot say that the self is independent of feeling either. Because whilst the self appears to our mind as being independent, it clearly has a relationship, therefore is dependent with feeling. Hence we say, I am happy, I am unhappy. So whilst the self appears to be independent, it is empty of being independent. So this is the third part, the conclusion. The conclusion of the investigation. So whilst the self appears to be self-existent, independent of anything, including feeling, we've come to recognize it is not independent but dependent. It has a relationship with feeling. So in this way, we come to realize that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. It's empty of existing by way of its own nature. And this is the wisdom realizing selflessness. And it is opposite to the ignorance that believes that the self is independent. And we recognize then that grasping at a self is an ignorance, a wrong consciousness.
Okay, no, thank you.
A real consciousness.
Is that the Tama de la Chisa Yama Chizumiller Rebetzel Lomachi, Ya Chesh on Roche, Session5. Then she's military the chick, and the choose on the she's military. Like Karon Gawadus, Karon Shimbu Che, and the Tassi didn't pass Charles Dorje, Karon Madi didn't, and Karon Gawadu Pat Shimbu Che, which in the Che shows, or the next Sanya shows, Karon the Pat shows, that is. And then that Lucine Dorje, that Koron Konda, Ma change that Koron's Kawadu, Kandesha, the Shudu, Shimbu. Meta 풍보 델레 강야 마데 바치 강야 민도스베 뒤기네 통야 말레스 통문데 상이들이야 제즈밀레르 바잘 도와주네 야 슈버스 나 가서 나랑 가와도 심비우체 카데스 제베나 다직 냐기네 민도스티 풍보에 된다 가데스 냐베나 균네 냐마성 세야 슈버레지 어다디 디르레 그런데다 최 냠는 제 디리 세상 결혼 디 심주치다 하고에 빼야고레스 하고고에 디리 송어레지.
So what I gave you now was a very condensed presentation on emptiness. But it's not the shortest presentation that's given. Probably the shortest one is by Milarepa, who a student came to see him and said, please teach me the Dharma. Give me practice to do, teach me the Dharma. And Milarepa said to him, before I teach you the Dharma, you go away and think to yourself, who is asking for this Dharma teaching? And that was all he said. And then the student went away, returned the next morning and said to Milarepa, now returning expecting his Dharma teaching, and said, well, I went away and I looked for who I am. I looked at my body, I looked in my various minds, so the aggregates. I couldn't find myself anywhere. And Milarepa said, and that was your Dharma teaching.
Okay.
Well, then thank you.